When you think of the Vietnam War, you probably picture the tunnel rats, the M60 gunners, and the chemical warfare, which were genuinely terrifying. But the American minigunners arguably had it far worse than some of those other roles. Huey gunners often had a life expectancy as low as 5 minutes in hot landing zones. So today, you're gonna see exactly how this incredible weapon came about and the horrifying fate of the people who had to use them. Okay, so the only reason the Gal-17 Alpha was even invented to begin with was because of one of the darkest strategic failures in American history. It would become known as the Battle of Ap Bac. On January 2nd, 1963, American advisors watched as South Vietnamese forces tried to crush a tiny Viet Cong group hiding in a village near the Mekong Delta. The Americans brought 15 helicopters and tanks and hundreds of troops to take on around 350 quote-unquote lightly armed fighters. But the machine guns completely failed at that. The M60s overheated after only about 200 rounds of sustained fire, and they jammed from the dust kicked up by the rotor blades. And worst of all, they just didn't put out enough bullets per second to pin down an enemy shooting from cover. So, by the end of that day, 5 helicopters had been shot down and 80 South Vietnamese soldiers were killed while the Viet Cong sneaked away into the jungle. It was at that moment the Pentagon realized they needed to swap the M60 for something better. They needed a weapon that could pour out so many rounds so quickly that no Viet Cong soldier could lift his head to shoot back. And more importantly, it needed to be extremely rugged. So General Electric looked at the old Gatling gun from the American Civil War. In those early days, soldiers cranked a handle to spin 6 barrels around, letting each barrel cool while the others fired. GE took that ancient concept and strapped an electric motor to it. The result was the Gal-17 Alpha minigun, a weapon that could fire 6,000 rounds per minute from its 6 spinning barrels. It fired 100 bullets every single second, or about 1 bullet every wingbeat of a hummingbird. And the barrels literally never overheated because each one only fired for a fraction of a second before rotating away. It almost never jammed either because the spinning action itself cleared bad rounds out of the chamber. So when it got tested, it could shred a truck into scrap metal in under 4 seconds. But this miracle weapon came with a price that nobody in that testing lab could possibly understand yet. The Gal-17 Alpha got rushed into Vietnam for field testing in early 1965, bolted onto a handful of Huey helicopters for door gunners to try out in real combat, and its very first real test came on the night of February 8th near a small coastal town called Bong Son. So here's what was happening on the ground that night. A US Army unit near Bong Son had just been overrun by a much larger Viet Cong force, and the Americans were pinned down in a shallow ditch with almost no cover, running low on ammo and surrounded on 3 sides. They radioed for help, but the nearest artillery was too far away to reach them in time, and the weather was getting worse by the minute, with heavy fog rolling in across the paddies. They called in an experimental gunship instead, a UH-1B Huey, fitted with 2 of the brand new Gal-17 Alpha miniguns strapped to its doors. The pilots had only been training with these guns for a few weeks, and they had never been used in a real combat situation. But it was their only chance to save the soldiers, because the men on the ground had maybe 20 minutes before being completely overrun. The moment the gunship arrived, the door gunner spun up both miniguns and pulled the triggers, and the sound alone made the Viet Cong stop in their tracks. You see, a normal machine gun fires with a fast sound that anyone can recognize. But a minigun at 6,000 rounds per minute doesn't just make individual shots, it makes a single deep roar like a chainsaw cutting through metal. Viet Cong fighters who survived that night described it as a new American flying monster. In roughly 3 minutes of firing runs, the 2 miniguns put about 18,000 rounds into the attacking force. So the Viet Cong ditched as quickly as they possibly could, leaving their wounded behind. And the trapped American unit walked out alive, barely believing what had just saved them. But that mission went to show how brutal it actually was to be the gunner on that night, because the door gunner sat in an open frame with absolutely no armor on his outside flank, and he had a full clear picture of what 6,000 rounds a minute did to the human body. The sound alone was loud enough to cause permanent hearing damage, even with ear protection in, and the minigun also burnt through belts of ammo, so fast that reloading had to happen every couple of minutes in the middle of a running firefight. So the crews that walked away alive from early missions like Bong Son knew straight away they had just witnessed something brand new in modern warfare. When the US Air Force saw exactly what they had on their hands, they scaled the program up as fast as General Electric could ship the guns over. By early 1967, miniguns were being bolted onto Hueys, Cobras, and even old C-47 cargo planes from the Second World War called the Douglas AC-47 Spooky, or Puff the Magic Dragon. And then the GAU-17 Alpha arrived in large scale, and it was at one massive jungle operation that the minigun would truly show the world what it could do and what it would cost the men firing it. By early 1967, the minigun had spread across the whole American war effort in Vietnam. Huey's had them mounted in the doorways, the new AH-1 Cobra gunships had them in nose turrets and wing pods, and the big AC-47 gunships had 3 of them pointing straight out the left side. The ground troops called those AC-47s Puff the Magic Dragon because the tracer rounds pouring down from them at night looked exactly like flame coming out of a giant dragon's mouth. And then Operation Junction City kicked off on February 22nd, 1967. This was the biggest American operation of the entire war at that point, and also the only full combat parachute drop of the whole Vietnam conflict. American commanders had intelligence that the Viet Cong High Command for all of South Vietnam, a headquarters called COSVN, was hiding in a jungle region called War Zone C just northwest of Saigon. So they sent in nearly 3 divisions of troops, the 173rd Airborne for the parachute jump, and hundreds of helicopters to box the enemy in. But the jungle in War Zone C was so dense that ground troops could barely see 50 feet in front of them, and this is where Puff really burst onto the scene. Each AC-47 carried around 24,000 rounds of ammunition and 45 parachute flares to light up the ground below, and it could loiter over a single target for hours, dropping flares, putting a tracer-laced bullet into every square yard of a football field-sized area in under 10 seconds. So when an American firebase got attacked at night, Puff was often the difference between being overrun and making it through to sunrise. One of the clearest examples happened on the night of March 10th, 1967 at Fire Support Base 2 near Prek Clock. 2 battalions of the Viet Cong 272nd Regiment came at the base with a heavy mortar barrage, then RPG fire, then wave after wave of infantry storming the perimeter, but the firebase had artillery support from nearby bases and overhead gunship coverage. 6 hours later, the Viet Cong broke off the attack and pulled back into the jungle. They left 197 dead around the wire, with just 3 Americans killed and 38 wounded inside the perimeter. Puff had done it again, and that pattern played out across the whole 82-day operation. But behind every one of those miracle saves, there was a gunner sitting in a steel doorframe watching what 6,000 rounds a minute actually did to the Viet Cong. And most gunners did not process that well. A C-47 door gunners reported some of the worst of it because the plane flew slowly and in such tight orbits that gunners could clearly see the ground through their sights. They saw every hit and every silhouette going down after being hit by a tracer light. And unlike a Huey gunner firing in short bursts during an insertion, the AC-47 gunners kept firing for hours at a time over a single battlefield below them. By the time Junction City calmed down in May of 1967, the operation had killed over 2,700 enemy fighters and captured tons of supplies and documents. But the Viet Cong headquarters had already slipped across the border into Cambodia before the operation even began, and the whole campaign was later called a strategic disappointment. And for the men running the miniguns, the worst chapter of the whole war was 4 years later, during Operation Lam Son 719. By 1971, American combat troops were being pulled out of Vietnam as fast as President Nixon could move them home. But the war itself wasn't over, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail was still pouring envious supplies south through Laos every single day. So the plan for Lam Son 719 was to send South Vietnamese troops across the border into Laos to cut the trail, with American air support covering them from above. American ground troops were banned from crossing the border by Congress, but American helicopters and their minigun door gunners were still allowed to fly in, and this is where the minigun crews had their worst 6 weeks of the entire war. The North Vietnamese had been expecting this kind of operation for years, and they had prepared for it relentlessly. Around 60,000 NVA troops were already dug into the target area, with hundreds of Soviet-built 37mm anti-aircraft guns waiting for whatever flew over. These guns could reach well above 10,000 feet, which was way higher than a Huey could even fly. So every single sortie into Laos meant flying straight through a wall of tracer fire and shrapnel, sometimes for hours at a time. By the end of the operation, a staggering 168 American helicopters had been shot down, with another 618 damaged by ground fire. That means on average, every single helicopter in the entire operation got hit more than 3 times. 55 American aircrewmen were killed in just 42 days of fighting, and total US casualties reached over 1,400 by the end, and the door gunners took the worst of it because they sat in an open doorway with nothing between them and the Envia gunners shooting back at them from the tree lines. So the gunners who did survive physically often came back with something nobody really had a proper name for yet, because in 1971, post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't a recognized diagnosis, and it wouldn't be officially added to the medical books until 1980. On paper, Lam Son 719 was called a partial success because the Ho Chi Minh Trail was disrupted for a few weeks. However, in reality, the South Vietnamese army lost nearly half its deployed force, the operation turned into a chaotic retreat, and the trail was running again within months. And then the Vietnam War ended, but the GAU-17 Alpha's legacy had only just begun. When the last American combat troops pulled out of Vietnam in 1973, the miniguns came home with them, but most of the guns went straight into warehouses or onto training helicopters for the next generation of pilots. And the men who had actually fired them in combat came home to a country that mostly just wanted to forget the whole war ever even happened. In total, around 2,700 helicopter crew chiefs and door gunners were killed across the whole war, which is roughly 7% of every American name on the Vietnam Memorial Wall. But the ones who came home physically in one piece often had a far longer and quieter fight ahead of them than anyone back in the States could see. One real example is a Vietnam door gunner called Jim Chancellor from the 119th Assault Helicopter Company, who has spent his later years speaking openly about it. Chancellor flew 240 combat days as a door gunner in Vietnam. More than 45 years after the war, he said he still scans every crowded room for weapons and checks every window of his house for footprints in the snow. His most well-known line about the job is that a door gunner's life expectancy in a hot landing zone was roughly 19 seconds, and that is the part most people don't understand about minigunners, because surviving the seat was really only the beginning of it. Out in the wider world, the weapon itself just kept rolling on. The GAU-17 Alpha is still in service today, mounted on Special Forces helicopters and patrol boats around the world. It has been fired in Iraq, Afghanistan, and pretty much every major American operation since Vietnam. But modern gunners get something the Vietnam crews never had, which is proper rotation, regular mental checkups, and mandatory counseling after engagements, and that is directly because of what happened to the Vietnam minigun generation. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing.